In the late summer of 1944, Europe was bleeding. Cities lay in ruins, skies black with smoke, and the ground trembled beneath the thunder of endless artillery fire. Men no longer fought for victory or pride. They fought simply to survive another day. Mercy had long vanished from the battlefield. Propaganda on both sides had replaced humanity with hatred, convincing young men that the face across the gun barrel was not a person but a monster. Among those who believed this most deeply were the German military doctors. They had been taught that the Allies were savages, cruel men who would rather see them die in agony than extend a hand of mercy. They were told that capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation. It was a message repeated so often that it became a part of them, an unshakable truth. But the war had its own way of challenging beliefs. One gray afternoon near the shattered French town of Saint-Lô, a small American field hospital operated in chaos. Tents trembled in the cold wind, their flapping canvas drowned out by the groans of the wounded. Inside, nurses shouted orders, surgeons worked like machines, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and iodine. The sound of scissors snapping, scalpels clinking, and the low hum of a generator gave the place a rhythm, an orchestra of desperation. An American medic burst through the tent flap, dragging a wounded soldier whose uniform was soaked in crimson. "He's fading fast," the medic shouted. The bullet had pierced the soldier's chest, and with every breath, blood bubbled at his lips. Doctors scrambled to make space, but before anyone could act, a figure moved toward the table from the corner of the room. A man in a torn, dirt-caked uniform with a faded red cross on the sleeve. For a moment, everyone froze. It was a German uniform. Rifles snapped upward. Fingers hovered over triggers. The man raised both hands, his face pale but determined. "Please," he said in broken English, "let me help." Without waiting for permission, he pressed his hands against the soldier's wound, applying pressure with expert precision. "You'll kill him if you wait," he shouted. For several tense seconds, the only sound was the gasping breath of the dying soldier. Then one of the American doctors, the chief surgeon, Major Henry Brooks, stepped closer, studying the man's hands. His movements were skilled, precise, desperate, yes, but trained. "Who are you?" Brooks demanded. "Dr. Franz Müller, Wehrmacht field surgeon," the man replied through heavy breaths. "Captured yesterday. I can save him. Stand down," an American sergeant barked. But Brooks raised his hand. The rifles lowered, reluctantly. Brooks nodded once. "Do it." Müller didn't waste a second. His hands moved fast, improvising a clamp from a bent pair of tweezers. His voice remained calm as he instructed the nurse for sutures, gauze, more pressure. The other doctors watched in silence as he worked, his focus unbroken, his breathing steady. Minutes passed like hours. Then, finally, the soldier coughed, weakly but alive. The bleeding stopped. Müller stepped back, sweat dripping from his forehead, his uniform stained deeper with someone else's blood. He expected a gun in his face, maybe a blow to the head. Instead, Major Brooks stepped forward and offered him a cup of water. "Good work, doctor," Brooks said quietly. Müller hesitated before taking it. The water was cold, clean. It tasted like something sacred after months of mud and fear. For a long moment, the two men, once enemies, just stood there. No hatred, no propaganda. Just two doctors who had both fought the same enemy all along, death itself. That night, the story spread through the camp like a whisper. The German doctor who saved an American. Some soldiers didn't believe it. Others said it was propaganda. But those who had seen it knew the truth. They had witnessed something that didn't belong to this war. Something rare. Müller sat quietly on a cot in a corner of the tent. They hadn't put him in a cage or tied his hands. He had been given a blanket, a small bowl of soup, and a strange feeling that unsettled him more than any interrogation could: kindness. He had been told Americans were monsters, yet here they were, treating him with respect. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of artillery in the distance, but inside the tent, the world felt still. Müller looked up at the lantern swinging above his head, its light flickering across the canvas. For the first time since the war began, he didn't feel like a soldier or a prisoner. He felt human again. Major Brooks approached him later that night. "You've got steady hands, doctor," he said, leaning on a crate. We could use those here. Miller looked up, unsure if he'd heard correctly. You want me to help? Brooks nodded. Our wounded don't care about uniforms. If you're willing, we'll treat you like any other doctor in this tent. The words didn't sound real. Miller had been trained to see men like Brooks as villains, but everything he'd seen since stepping into that tent told him otherwise. He nodded slowly. Yes, he said. I'll help. From that night onward, the German POW doctor worked side by side with the Americans, treating men he had once called enemies. Each day, his disbelief faded a little more. Each day, he began to see that compassion wasn't a weakness. It was what made them strong. In the dim glow of that field hospital, surrounded by pain and loss, a quiet truth revealed itself. Even in war, humanity could survive. Because sometimes, the most powerful victory isn't the one fought with guns. It's the one fought with kindness. Days passed, and the once suspicious eyes of the American medics began to soften. The German doctor who had arrived as a prisoner now moved freely among them. His name spread quietly from tent to tent. Dr. Franz Müller, the man who didn't let uniforms decide who deserved to live. At first, some soldiers avoided him. They whispered as he passed, their faces carved with anger. Many of them had lost friends to German bullets, to Luftwaffe bombs, to the cruel winter of the Ardennes. To them, he wasn't a doctor. He was the enemy who had worn the wrong patch on his arm. But in the chaos of war, hate has a strange way of tiring the heart. And sometimes, kindness speaks louder than 1,000 arguments. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and turned the sky blood red, a new batch of wounded arrived. Among them was a young American soldier named Corporal James Harper. His leg had been shattered by shrapnel, and infection had set in. The air reeked of decay when they brought him in. The nurses hesitated. Amputation seemed the only way to save him. Muller examined the wound silently. The flesh was black at the edges, the tissue dying fast. But there was a chance, a small, fragile chance. He's too young to lose the leg, Muller said. Major Brooks frowned. If we don't cut it, the infection spreads. He dies. I can try a different method, Muller said calmly. We used it in the Eastern Front, when we had nothing else. Brooks hesitated. The nurse looked at him, waiting. Finally, the major nodded. Do it. He's yours. Hours passed. The lanterns burned low. Sweat rolled down Muller's temple as he worked, his hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. He whispered in German under his breath. Old prayers, fragments of memory from a world before the war. Brooks stood beside him, passing tools, learning without a word. When it was over, Muller stepped back. The leg remained, stitched, bandaged, saved. Harper's breathing steadied. The nurses stared, silent, as if witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. By dawn, the news had spread. The German POW had saved one of their own again. Harper woke later that day, looked down at his leg, then looked up at Muller, standing by his bed. You did this? Harper asked weakly. Muller nodded. Yes. The young soldier smiled faintly. Guess you're not all that bad, Doc. For the first time in months, Muller laughed. Not the forced laughter of survival, the real kind. It startled even him. That small exchange did something to the camp. The tension began to fade. The guards stopped watching his every move. Soldiers nodded to him in passing. The nurses brought him coffee, sometimes even joked with him. In war, friendships don't bloom easily, but respect, earned through sacrifice, can grow in the harshest soil. That night, as the wounded slept, Muller walked outside the tent. The stars hung over the battlefield like scattered ashes. Somewhere out there, men from both sides still fought and died, still believed the other was evil. Major Brooks joined him quietly. You've been busy, Doctor, he said with a small smile. Muller nodded. Your men, they are kind, even to someone like me. Brooks took a slow breath. We're not fighting you, Franz. We're fighting what your country became. But a man's soul, that's his own. The words lingered in the cold air. For Muller, it was the first time anyone had said something like that to him. Back home, everything had been rules, loyalty, orders. Here, in a camp of enemies, he had found something that felt closer to truth. Later that week, An American nurse named Clara brought Mueller a folded piece of paper. "Mail from headquarters," she said. "They approved your request." He unfolded it slowly. The paper said that Dr. Franz Mueller, captured Wehrmacht surgeon, was officially assigned to assist in medical duties under supervision of Major Henry Brooks. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was part of the team. That evening, as the sun melted into gold beyond the shattered trees, the men of the 3rd Field Hospital gathered for dinner. The air was thick with laughter and the smell of bacon, a scent Mueller hadn't known in years. He hesitated before sitting down, unsure if he belonged. But Brooks waved him over. "Sit, doctor," the major said. "You earned it." Mueller smiled faintly and took a seat. The taste of the food brought memories. Home, his wife's cooking, his daughter's laughter. For a few moments, the war disappeared. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered again, a cruel reminder that peace was only temporary. But for that single evening, inside that humble tent, the world felt almost whole again. And as laughter echoed through the camp, one truth stood above the noise, that even in the darkest corners of war, light could still find its way through the cracks of humanity. Because when men choose compassion over cruelty, even enemies can become brothers. Winter came early that year. The cold crept into the camp like an unwelcome guest, biting through uniforms and blankets alike. The tents rattled under the harsh wind, and the breath of every man turned to mist in the dim morning air. Supplies were running low, medical kits were nearly empty, and the wounded, they kept coming. For Dr. Franz Mueller, the days began to blend into one another. Endless hours of stitching, disinfecting, praying. The war outside never seemed to end, but inside that small American field hospital, a different kind of battle was being fought. One between despair and hope. Major Brooks noticed it too. The men had changed. They still wore the same uniforms, still carried the same rifles, but something in their eyes had softened. Hatred didn't come as easily anymore. The stories of Mueller's work had spread beyond their camp, whispered through military channels. Other divisions began requesting medical advice from the German doctor who saved Americans. The first official request came from a nearby camp, housing both Allied and Axis prisoners. A deadly outbreak of gangrene was spreading through the infirmary. The American medical officer had run out of options. They asked if Mueller could come. Brooks hesitated. "If I send you there, it's outside our lines. It's risky." Mueller didn't blink. "They are men in need, Major. It does not matter what side they are." Brooks gave a long sigh and nodded. "Then you'll go with my escort. God help us all if command finds out." The journey took half a day through frost-bitten terrain. The jeep rattled over frozen mud as snowflakes fell like ashes. When they arrived, the scene was grim. Rows of cots filled with soldiers, their limbs blackened by infection, the air thick with the smell of rot and hopelessness. Mueller didn't waste a moment. He called for boiling water, salt, clean rags, anything he could find. The American medic in charge, Lieutenant Morris, watched in disbelief as the German prisoner took charge of the entire room. "You sure you know what you're doing, Doc?" Morris asked. "I've seen this before," Mueller replied calmly. "In Stalingrad, we learned to fight death with what little we had for the next 12 hours. Mueller worked without rest. He showed the Americans new ways to clean wounds using alcohol vapors, taught them how to prevent necrosis without amputation, how to save not just limbs, but men's futures. When the first patient survived through the night, hope spread like fire through the infirmary. Later, as Mueller stepped outside to catch his breath, Morris approached him. "Never thought I'd say this," he muttered, "but you might have saved more Yanks today than half our own doctors." Mueller smiled faintly. "Death doesn't wear a uniform, Lieutenant. Neither should mercy." Those words stuck with Morris long after. He wrote them in a letter to his wife, who later told that story to newspapers back home. Within weeks, the German doctor who healed his enemies became an unofficial legend across Allied medical units. When Mueller returned to Brooks' camp, the men greeted him with applause. Even the hard-faced sergeant who once kept his rifle aimed at him now offered a handshake. It was awkward, hesitant, but sincere. That night, Brooks poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside Mueller. "Seems you've made quite a name for yourself," he said with a grin. Mueller chuckled softly. "Strange, isn't it? In my country, I am called a traitor. Here, a hero Brooks looked into the fire, his voice low. Maybe it just means you're human. They sat in silence, the crackle of burning wood filling the air. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the camp in white. For a moment, it didn't feel like a battlefield at all. It felt like peace trying to remember what it once was. But peace, in wartime, never stays for long. A week later, orders came from command. The Germans had launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The American lines were breaking. Casualties were pouring in faster than they could be treated. Brooks called Müller into his tent. "France, they're sending us to the front. A mobile hospital unit. We'll be near Bastogne by morning." Müller didn't hesitate. "Then we go." The convoy rolled through the night, engines growling under the dark sky. Tracer rounds streaked across the horizon like falling stars. By dawn, they were setting up tents in the middle of chaos. Explosions rumbling in the distance, soldiers running, shouting, bleeding. Within hours, their hospital overflowed. Every cot was filled. Men screamed for help, nurses rushed from bed to bed, and still more came. Müller worked beside Brooks, his hands moving like clockwork. There was no time to think, no time to rest. The noise, the smoke, the smell, it was all one endless blur. In that nightmare, he saved dozens, Americans, British, even German prisoners dragged in by patrols. He treated them all the same. A young American medic watched him, his voice shaking as he whispered to another nurse, "That guy's a German. Doesn't seem possible." And yet, in that chaos, the impossible kept happening. As night fell, the front line drew closer. Mortars began landing near the camp. A tent collapsed. The lights went out. Brooks shouted for everyone to take cover. But Müller didn't stop. He knelt beside a dying man and kept pressing his hands against the wound until the bleeding slowed. When the shelling finally ceased, Müller sat back, drenched in sweat, surrounded by men who would live because of him. In a war built on hate, he had found a purpose that defied it. The shelling never really stopped. It only paused to let men believe they could breathe again. Smoke rolled through the valley like a ghost that refused to leave, and the snow beneath the canvas tents had turned to mud streaked with blood. Somewhere out in the distance, the sound of distant gunfire echoed like thunder over broken hills. Inside the field hospital, silence was a rare gift. The doctors barely spoke anymore, only gestures, nods, a few short words that carried entire sentences. The air was thick with fatigue and morphine, the kind of exhaustion that crawled deep into the soul. Then came the call that would change everything. A jeep screeched into camp, headlights cutting through the smoke. "We've got survivors near the ridge," a soldier shouted. 2 of them, one of ours and a Kraut, both trapped under the same truck. Major Brooks didn't hesitate. "Müller, you're with me." Minutes later, they were racing across the ruined road, headlights off, hearts pounding. The smell of burning oil filled the air. The truck lay on its side in a crater, its steel twisted like paper. The cries came faintly from beneath it. 2 voices, both fading. Brooks and Müller dropped to their knees beside the wreckage. One voice was speaking English, the other, German. Brooks called out, "We're here. Hold on." "Bitte," the German voice groaned. "Ich kann nicht atmen." Müller crawled closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Easy now. Don't move," he said in German, his voice calm. Then, switching to English, "Major, they're pinned under the same beam. If we lift it, both could bleed out." Brooks cursed under his breath. "We'll have to risk it. Can we stop the bleeding?" Müller nodded. "I'll try." They worked together, hands numb, their knees sinking into the icy mud. With a lever made from a broken rifle, they pried up the steel just enough for Müller to slide under. He saw them then, 2 young men barely older than boys, their faces pale, both gripping the same blood-soaked bandage that pressed between them. The American had taken shrapnel to the chest. The German's leg was crushed beyond saving. And yet, in their agony, they were holding each other's hands. "Don't you let go, buddy," the American whispered weakly. Müller froze. In that moment, uniforms meant nothing. He saw humanity, raw and bleeding. He swallowed hard and went to work. He called for gauze, morphine, anything. Brooks handed down what little they had. As the minutes passed, the cold bit deeper. and the ground trembled with distant explosions. Müller rapped the American's chest, then moved to the German's leg. "You'll live," he murmured. "Both of you." The German looked at him, eyes clouded with pain. "Sind Sie Amerikaner?" Müller shook his head. "Nein. I'm a German doctor." "You're safe." The soldier blinked in disbelief. "A doctor? For me?" "For both of you," Müller replied softly. Finally, they managed to free the two men. The American, barely conscious, whispered, He saved me. The Kraut saved me." Müller looked down and realized what had happened. When the truck exploded, the German had thrown himself toward the American to shield him from debris. Two enemies who should have killed each other, bound instead by the instinct to protect. Brooks stared for a long moment, then whispered, "We bring them both back." They carried the men through the snow under falling flares, each step a battle against exhaustion. Back at the camp, the medics cleared space. Müller worked on both of them side by side, refusing rest until their breathing steadied. When it was over, he sat back on the cold ground, trembling. Brooks placed a hand on his shoulder. "You just saved two men from opposite sides of the war, Franz. Do you realize what that means?" Müller nodded slowly. "It means there's still something left worth saving." The story spread faster than any bullet could travel. Soldiers talked about it around fires. Medics whispered it while cleaning their tools. Some refused to believe it, said it was just another war tale. But others knew. They had seen the doctor who no longer cared about flags or sides. Weeks later, when both the young American and the German regained strength, they met again in the recovery tent. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood each other perfectly. One raised a trembling hand in gratitude. The other took it. No words, just silence, stronger than any speech. For Müller, that moment became something sacred. It was the proof he needed that war could destroy nations but never the human heart. He stood outside that night, watching the stars glimmer faintly beyond the smoke. Somewhere in those same skies, bombers were flying, men were dying, and the earth still shook with madness. But here, in this small camp of miracles, a German doctor had saved the lives of two men who had been taught to hate him. And perhaps, for the first time, he believed that even in hell, you could still build a small piece of heaven, if you chose to. The snow had melted into gray slush by the time the new year came. The camp had grown quieter, not because the war was easing, but because exhaustion had replaced every other emotion. The wounded slept longer now, their dreams haunted by sounds they'd never forget. Nurses whispered instead of speaking. The smell of medicine lingered everywhere. Dr. Franz Müller barely slept anymore. His hands were never still, bandaging, writing, preparing. Yet behind the calm in his eyes, there was something else, something unspoken. Major Brooks had noticed it. Late one evening, after the patients were finally resting, he found Müller sitting alone outside the tent, a half-finished letter in his hands. The candle beside him flickered weakly, throwing shadows across his tired face. "Another letter that'll never be sent?" Brooks asked quietly. Müller looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Yes, but it helps to write." Brooks sat beside him. "You've been carrying something since the day you got here. You save everyone else, Franz, but you never talk about yourself. Why?" For a long moment, Müller said nothing. The sound of the wind filled the silence between them. Then he took a slow breath. "I had a daughter," he began. "Her name was Anna. She was 7 when the war began. My wife, Elise, worked at the hospital in Berlin. When the bombing started, I was sent to the Eastern Front. I thought I would be gone for months. It became years." He paused, eyes glinting in the faint light. "One night, our convoy was hit. We lost everything, supplies, food, even our wounded. I remember finding a small church nearby and writing to Elise from there. I told her I would come home soon." He looked away, voice breaking slightly. That letter never reached her. Allied bombers hit Berlin 2 days later. My home was gone. I got the news from a nurse who recognized my name on the casualty list." Brooks lowered his head. "I'm sorry, Franz." Müller nodded slowly. "After that, I stopped believing in sides. I kept treating men, because that's all I knew how to do. But I wasn't doing it for the Reich anymore. I was doing it for her, for the child who believed her father healed people, The fire crackled softly between them. Brooks took a sip of his coffee, then said, "And that's why you keep working like a man possessed." Mueller smiled faintly. "I suppose so. Every life I save feels like one she might have wanted saved." Brooks looked at him for a long time before saying quietly, "You know, most men in this war will never know peace again, but you might have already found it, in your own way." The words hung in the cold night air. Mueller didn't answer. He didn't need to. Inside the tent, Corporal Harper, the soldier whose leg Mueller had saved months before, sat up on his cot, listening to the muffled voices outside. He couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough to understand. The German doctor wasn't fighting for Germany anymore. He was fighting for something pure, something that war had almost erased. The next day, when the sun rose weakly over the frost-covered camp, a new batch of wounded arrived. One of them was a German lieutenant, barely breathing, clutching a blood-soaked photo. When they brought him in, Mueller froze. The photo slipped from the man's hand and landed near Mueller's boot. It was of a young woman and a child, both smiling, standing beside a river. Mueller's chest tightened. The picture could have been his own family. Without a word, he began to work. His hands shook slightly as he cleaned the wound. The man opened his eyes for a brief second and whispered, "Doctor, thank you." Then he passed out. Mueller stitched the wound carefully, more carefully than he had ever done before. When he was finished, he stepped outside and leaned against the tent pole, breathing heavily. Brooks came to him again. "You all right?" Mueller nodded weakly. "It's strange. When I save one of them, I feel like I'm saving a piece of myself. Maybe that's all that's left of who I used to be." Brooks placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing more than that, Franz. You're teaching my men something they'll never forget. That mercy doesn't have a flag." That night, the camp gathered for the first time in weeks. The soldiers had built a small fire, and someone brought a broken radio they'd managed to fix. Music, crackling, faint, but real, filled the air. For the first time since the war began, laughter returned. Not loud, but gentle, honest. Mueller sat with them, listening quietly. One soldier handed him a tin cup of coffee. "To the doc," the man said, "for keeping us alive." Mueller raised his cup slowly, humbled. "To all of us," he replied, "for remembering we're still men." As the firelight danced on their faces, he looked around the circle. Americans, Germans, medics, soldiers, all sitting together. The world outside was still at war, but here, in this small pocket of light, something greater than victory had taken root. The sound of laughter faded into the cold night wind. Somewhere far off, another explosion rumbled, but it couldn't reach them anymore, not tonight. Because for that brief moment, the war had paused, humanity had not. The letter arrived at dawn. It was sealed with the red wax of the U.S. Army and carried by a courier who didn't smile, didn't talk, didn't even remove his gloves. Major Brooks broke the seal and read it silently, his expression tightening with every line. Dr. Franz Mueller watched from across the camp, noticing the sudden shift in Brooks's face. Something was wrong. When Brooks finally looked up, his tone was clipped, official. "Colonel Davis is coming." Mueller frowned. "The inspection officer?" Brooks nodded. "Washington sent him to evaluate our camp. They've heard about your work, saving German prisoners, treating them before our own men." Mueller's hands went still. The morning air, heavy with the scent of smoke and frost, suddenly felt colder. "And that's a problem." Brooks hesitated. "To me, no. But to them, it's politics, Franz, not medicine." By noon, the sound of engines broke the silence. 3 jeeps rolled through the gates, mud splashing against their tires. Colonel Davis stepped out, a tall man in a pristine uniform, every metal polished, every button straight. His eyes scanned the camp with military precision, cold and calculating. Brooks saluted. "Sir, welcome to Camp Mercy." Davis didn't return the gesture. "Major Brooks, I'll keep this brief. Washington's concerned about the resources being diverted to enemy combatants, especially under the supervision of a former Nazi doctor." The soldiers nearby froze at the word Nazi. Mueller, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the tent, felt the weight of 100 eyes turned toward him. Brooks stepped forward. "With respect, sir, Dr. Müller has saved more American lives here than any man I've ever met. Davis's gaze didn't soften. That may be true. But his file says he served with the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. That makes him a war asset, not an ally. The camp was silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Müller spoke calmly, his accent sharp against the silence. "Colonel, I served as a doctor. I treated whoever came through my tent. I never chose a flag for my patients." Davis crossed his arms. "That's convenient, doctor. But we both know medicine was used by your people for experiments, for torture. I've seen the reports." The words hit like bullets. Müller's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Then you know what happens when doctors forget their purpose." Brooks stepped in. "Sir, I can vouch for him. Every man here can. You'll find no evidence of wrongdoing." Davis's tone was dry. "We'll see." He turned to his men. "Search the medical quarters. I want every file, every record, and keep an eye on the doctor." As the officers moved toward the tents, Müller turned to Brooks. "You said they'd understand." Brooks sighed. "I hoped they would." That night, tension hung over the camp like fog. Soldiers who once joked with Müller now avoided his gaze. The radio remained silent. In his tent, Müller sat alone, staring at the small metal box under his cot, a box filled with letters, photographs, and notes from every soldier he'd treated. Proof of humanity, he thought. Proof that kindness had existed even here. He didn't hear Davis enter. The colonel stood in the doorway, holding a stack of folders. "You kept meticulous records, Doctor. Impressive. You even documented the POWs you treated." "Yes," Müller replied quietly, "because their lives mattered." Davis threw one of the folders on the table. "And what about this?" Inside was a letter, written in German. Müller recognized it instantly. It was one of his unsent letters to his daughter, Anna. Davis's voice was sharp. "You've been corresponding with German contacts?" Müller stood, his voice rising for the first time. "That's my daughter. She's dead." The tent went silent. For a moment, Davis looked uncertain, even ashamed. Then he turned away. "We'll confirm your story. Until then, you're relieved of duty," Brooks protested. "Sir, you can't." "I just did." Davis's tone left no room for argument. He left without another word. Müller stood motionless, the letter still trembling in his hands. Outside, the camp lights flickered. The soldiers continued their duties, but the air was thick with unease. Later that night, Private Harper entered Müller's tent quietly. He placed something on the table, his own photograph, a bullet still lodged near the edge. "You saved me, Doc," he said softly. "That's all I need to know. The colonel can go to hell one by one." Other soldiers followed. Each left something small, a note, a bandage, a medal, symbols of gratitude, silent testimony against suspicion. By morning, Colonel Davis returned to find the doctor's tent covered with these tokens. He looked around, realizing the truth in their quiet rebellion. These weren't soldiers defending an enemy. They were defending a man who had reminded them what it meant to be human. Brooks stood beside him, arms crossed. "You can report whatever you like, sir. But this camp runs because of him. Without Müller, we're just another pile of bodies waiting for the war to end." For a long moment, Davis said nothing. Then he turned to Müller, his voice lower now. "You'll stay under supervision, but continue your work, Doctor." He walked away before Müller could respond. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy calm, Brooks handed Müller a cup of coffee and said, "Guess Washington decided they like miracles after all." Müller smiled faintly. "No, Major. They just realized miracles don't care about sides." The two men sat quietly, the fire crackling between them, the world outside still torn apart. But inside this small circle of light, compassion had once again triumphed over politics. It began with a cough, a faint hollow sound echoing through the medical tent before dawn. Then another. Then 10 more by sunrise. Within hours, fevered men lay sweating in their bunks, eyes sunken, lips dry, skin pale as candle wax. Dr. Franz Müller recognized the signs immediately. He didn't need a stethoscope or charts to know what this was. "Typhus," he whispered, his heart sinking. "God help us." By noon, chaos had returned to Camp Mercy. Nurses rushed between cots with masks pulled over their faces. Buckets of boiling water steamed beside the tents. The stench of sickness, the sour mix of sweat, blood, and decay, spread faster than the wind. Colonel Davis burst into the infirmary, his voice sharp. "What's happening here, doctor?" Mueller didn't look up from the patient he was treating. "It's spreading fast. We've got at least 30 infected already." Davis's expression darkened. "Can it be contained?" Mueller straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "If we isolate the patients, disinfect everything, and stop panic, yes. But we're short on supplies, and we can't move the camp. If it reaches the barracks, it'll wipe everyone out." Davis looked around, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. "You're saying we're sitting on a death trap?" "I'm saying," Mueller replied firmly, "that if we work together, we can stop it." The words hung in the air. For the first time, Davis didn't argue. He nodded once. "Then tell me what you need." Mueller began barking orders like a general. "Boil every bandage. Burn every scrap of dirty linen. I need carbolic acid, quinine, and clean water. And move the German POWs to the far side of the camp. They're weaker. They'll fall first." Brooks hurried in, pale-faced. "Doctor, one of the kitchen hands just collapsed near the supply tent. It's spreading faster than we thought." Mueller grabbed his bag. "Show me." The kitchen area was a nightmare. Flies buzzing over spilled food. A soldier convulsing on the floor. Mueller knelt beside him and felt his forehead. The fever was high enough to burn through bone. He looked up at Brooks. "We have 12 hours, maybe less. After that, this whole camp will be infected." That night, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the tents as thunder cracked overhead. The wind tore through the camp like the scream of a dying world. Inside the infirmary, Davis stood beside Mueller, both wearing improvised masks. They moved from cot to cot, checking pulses, changing bandages. The colonel's crisp uniform was soaked and stained, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Mueller through the dim light of a lantern. "I never thought I'd see the day I took orders from a German." Mueller smiled faintly. "And I never thought I'd see an American risk his life for my patients. Seems war makes strange allies." As the night dragged on, their roles blurred. Davis carried supplies, comforted soldiers, even held down a man as Mueller injected morphine. When a young American medic collapsed from exhaustion, Davis caught him before he hit the ground. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the fever had not. 6 men were dead, 40 more burned with infection. Mueller hadn't slept in 2 days, but he refused to stop. When the colonel found him kneeling by a cot, whispering a prayer in German, he finally understood something. This wasn't about sides anymore. It was about saving what little of humanity they had left. "Doctor," Davis said quietly, "you're killing yourself." Mueller didn't look up. "If I stop now, more will die." "Then let me help." Mueller met his gaze for the first time without hostility. "You already are, Colonel." For the next 3 days, they worked side by side. When Mueller's hands shook too badly to hold a scalpel, Davis steadied them. When Davis faltered, Mueller reminded him that saving one life was victory enough. Slowly, the tide turned. The fevers broke. The coughing quieted. The morgue tent stopped filling. On the 6th morning, Mueller stepped out into the cold air and felt the first warmth of the sun cut through the mist. For the first time in weeks, silence didn't feel like death. It felt like peace. Brooks approached with a grin. "You did it, Doc. The camp's clear." Mueller exhaled slowly, looking toward the horizon. "No, we did it." Later that day, Davis gathered the remaining soldiers. His voice carried across the camp, calm and steady. "Men, you owe your lives to Dr. Franz Mueller. Remember that name, because when history tells the story of this war, it should remember not just who fought, but who healed." The camp erupted in applause. Some cheered, some wept. Even those who'd once distrusted the German doctor now saluted him. That night, as the campfire crackled, Davis handed Mueller a small silver cross, the kind soldiers wore around their necks. "You've earned this more than any man I know." Mueller looked at it, then shook his head. "I don't deserve this." Davis smiled faintly. "Neither do any of us. But that's the point, isn't it?" The firelight danced across their faces as silence fell between them again. This time, a silence of understanding. For once, war had not divided them. It had made them human again. The radio crackled to life one gray morning. Berlin has fallen. German forces have surrendered. The words drifted through Camp Mercy like a ghost, soft, unreal, almost holy. For a few seconds, no one moved. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Then a roar erupted. Laughter, cheers, tears. Men embraced each other, shouted, threw helmets in the air. After years of fear and blood, it was over. But not for everyone. Dr. Franz Müller stood outside the infirmary, the wind tugging at his tattered coat. Around him, soldiers celebrated their victory. Brooks was grinning from ear to ear. Colonel Davis allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Yet Müller's face remained unreadable. Brooks noticed. "You don't look like a man who just survived the end of the world." Müller didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the clouds glowed faintly pink. "For you, it's an ending," he said quietly. "For me, I'm not sure what it is." Brooks frowned. "You're free, Doc. You can go home." "Home," Müller repeated, almost to himself. "To what? My wife and daughter are gone. My country is rubble. And my name." He looked down at his hands, scarred, shaking. "My name is poison in the mouths of men." Davis stepped closer, his tone softer than usual. "You don't have to go back, Doctor. You've earned a place here. The Army could use men like you in reconstruction, medical aid, relief missions. Hell, we'll vouch for you." Müller looked at him, the same man who, weeks ago, had called him a Nazi. "Why would you do that?" Davis took a long breath. "Because you reminded me what this war was supposed to be about. Not hate, not revenge, just decency. We lost sight of that." "You didn't," the doctor smiled faintly. "You give me too much credit." "No," Brooks said, stepping in. "You give yourself too little." For a while, the three men stood in silence, listening to the wind whip across the tents. Somewhere, an accordion played a fragile tune. One of the nurses had found it among the POW supplies. The sound floated across the camp, fragile and human. Later that evening, a convoy of trucks arrived. Orders from headquarters. The POWs were to be transferred. Some were going home, others not. Müller oversaw their medical clearances personally. He shook hands with every man who could stand, and for those who couldn't, he gave a soft word, a quiet promise that they wouldn't be forgotten. One young German soldier, barely 17, hesitated before boarding the truck. "Herr Doctor," he said softly, "will you come back to Germany?" Müller hesitated, then placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "If I do, it will be to build, not to bury." As the trucks rolled away, he stood watching until the last one disappeared over the hill. The dust they left behind glimmered in the evening sun like ash. That night, the camp held a celebration. Fires burned bright, food was passed around, and the air rang with laughter and song. Brooks dragged Müller over to join the others. "You've earned a drink, Doc," he said, handing him a tin cup. Müller accepted it, though he barely tasted the whiskey. Around the fire, soldiers sang "God Bless America," their voices rough but full of hope. For a moment, he imagined another song, one his wife used to hum when their daughter slept, a lullaby drowned long ago by artillery. When the singing faded, Davis raised his cup. "To those who fought," he said. Then, looking at Müller, he added, "And to those who healed." The men echoed the words. "To those who healed." Müller felt his throat tighten. He lifted his cup in silence. As the night deepened, he walked out beyond the camp perimeter, where the grass had just begun to grow again between the craters. The stars stretched endless above him. Somewhere out there was Germany, broken, bleeding, but still alive. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Anna, I did my best." When he returned to the camp, Brooks was waiting. "The colonel's arranging papers for you," he said. "You'll stay here a while, help rebuild the hospitals. After that, wherever you want to go." Müller nodded slowly. "Wherever I go, Major, I think I'll still be here." Brooks smiled. "You mean with us?" Müller looked around at the camp, the patched tents, the men laughing, the flags fluttering in the wind. "No," he said softly. "With the memory of what we did here, of who we chose to be when the world forgot how." The next morning, when the sun rose over Camp Mercy, It found Muller already at work, tending to the last of the wounded. His coat was still stained, his hands still tired, but in his eyes burned something new. Not guilt, not fear, but quiet purpose. The war was over, but the healing had only just begun. And in that moment, among the ruins of victory, one German doctor stood as proof that mercy, even in the darkest age, was the truest kind of courage.
The war had ended, but for some men, the battle never truly stopped. Europe was healing, slowly, painfully. Cities once turned to ash were learning how to breathe again, and in a small, forgotten town outside Frankfurt, a lone doctor worked in silence. His name was Franz Muller. He wasn't a hero in the way the world liked to imagine them. No medals, no parades, no flags waving in his honor, just a quiet clinic, a worn-out coat, and a man who had spent years trying to rebuild the one thing the war had nearly destroyed, his faith in humanity. Every morning, people lined up outside his door, and children, farmers, widows, they didn't care what uniform he once wore. They cared that when he looked at them, he saw patients, not sides. He treated them all, without question, without payment, without rest. And sometimes, after everyone left, he'd stand outside under the dim German sky, staring west, toward America, toward the men who had once called him their enemy and later their brother. One evening, a letter arrived stamped with the seal of the United States Army Medical Corps. Muller hesitated before opening it, as if afraid of what ghosts might crawl out. But inside, there were no ghosts, only gratitude. It was signed by Colonel Robert Davis, the very man who had once accused him of treason. "You are hereby recognized," it read, "for saving 146 American soldiers and 39 German prisoners of war. Your compassion transcended conflict and reminded us what humanity truly means." Muller set the letter down and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence felt kind outside. The evening bells rang. Children laughed in the street, and for a moment he imagined the fires of Camp Mercy again. The sound of men healing instead of killing. Thousands of miles away in a small American town, another man sat on his porch, old, gray, and tired. Major Thomas Brooks. The war had left him scarred in more ways than one, but that night he smiled as he read the same letter. His grandson ran out, holding a toy airplane. "Grandpa," he asked, "tell me a story from the war." Brooks looked at him for a long time, and then said quietly, "I'll tell you one, but it's not about fighting. It's about a man who healed the enemy and saved us all." The boy blinked. Was he American? Brooks shook his head, smiling softly. No, he was German, but that didn't matter. Not where it counted. Back in Germany, Franz Muller placed the letter inside a small wooden box beside an old photograph of his wife and daughter. "Now you can rest," he whispered. "I did what I could." He never asked for forgiveness. He simply earned it, one heartbeat at a time. History will never build statues for him. There will be no parades, no songs, no speeches, but somewhere between the rubble and the redemption, a German doctor proved that mercy, true mercy, can outlive empires. And sometimes the bravest men in war are the ones who choose to heal instead of hate.